For Love of Country. This video is based on key insights from the book For Love of Country by Tulsi Gabbard. Chapter 1, The End of Our Democracy. Tulsi Gabbard details a growing disillusionment with the Democratic Party, culminating in her decision to leave it. The core of her reasoning centers on what she perceives as a dangerous abuse of power by the party, specifically the weaponization of law enforcement and the national security apparatus against political opponents. This isn't about disagreements over policy, but a fundamental concern that the Democrats are eroding the very foundations of American democracy. She frames this as a shift towards a banana republic style of governance, where political rivals are targeted rather than debated. The catalyst for Gabbard's departure, as she recounts, was the indictment of Donald Trump by a special counsel. While acknowledging Trump's controversies, she argues the act itself, a sitting president using the justice system to prosecute a leading political opponent, set a terrifying precedent. She worries this opens the door for future administrations to do the same, creating a cycle of political retribution. Gabbard vividly remembers being in Colorado Springs when the news broke, and how commentators on certain news networks seemed to celebrate the indictment, which she found deeply troubling. This reaction, she believes, showed a willingness to prioritize political victory over the principles of justice and fairness. Gabbard illustrates her point with several examples, contrasting the treatment of Trump with that of Hillary Clinton during a similar investigation into her handling of classified information. She recalls James Comey's detailed public statement outlining Clinton's wrongdoing, yet the decision not to prosecute. She then points to the discovery of classified documents at President Biden's home and office, and the subsequent, more lenient investigation led by Robert Hur. The author argues this demonstrates a clear double standard, one set of rules for the Democrat elite and another for everyone else. She emphasizes that this isn't about defending specific actions, but about the principle of equal application of the law. The author expands on this theme of selective justice, citing instances like James Clapper and John Brennan lying under oath, and the coordinated effort by intelligence officials to dismiss the Hunter Biden laptop story as Russian disinformation. She sees these as further evidence of a system where those aligned with the Democratic Party are shielded from accountability, while opponents are relentlessly targeted. Gabbard recounts a personal experience at a local Democratic meeting in South Carolina, where she was directly asked if she was working for Putin, highlighting the pervasive nature of these accusations and the difficulty of overcoming preconceived notions fueled by partisan narratives. Gabbard also criticizes what she sees as a pattern of dishonesty and manipulation within the Democratic Party, tracing it back to the Russia collusion narrative surrounding Trump's 2016 election. She details how the Clinton campaign actively sought to create and disseminate false information about Trump, even involving the FBI in the process. She points to the Steele dossier as a prime example of fabricated intelligence used to justify surveillance of Trump and his associates. The author believes this big hoax, as she calls it, demonstrates a willingness to undermine democratic processes in pursuit of political gain. The author further argues that the Democrats are actively dividing the country, labeling anyone who disagrees with their agenda as an extremist and a threat to democracy. She references President Biden's speech at Independence Hall, which she interprets as a direct attack on millions of Americans who support Trump. Gabbard believes this rhetoric is dangerous, creating an environment where political opponents are demonized and their rights are disregarded. She connects this to the politicization of law enforcement, citing examples of the FBI targeting parents who speak out at school board meetings and the IRS allegedly scrutinizing conservative groups. Gabbard concludes by emphasizing the importance of the rule of law and the dangers of allowing political power to be used against individuals. She draws a parallel to authoritarian regimes, warning that if this trend continues, America risks losing its democratic character. She urges other Democrats who value the country to join her in rejecting this abuse of power and defending the principles of fairness, justice, and equal treatment under the law. Her departure, she asserts, is not a rejection of democratic ideals, but a defense of them. Chapter 2: Fading Light of Freedom. Tulsi Gabbard explains in this chapter why she could no longer identify with the Democratic Party, a decision she didn't take lightly. She believes the party has dramatically changed, moving away from its historical commitment to protecting individual freedoms and instead acting like an overbearing Big Brother government, constantly trying to control people's lives. Gabbard emphasizes that the Founding Fathers specifically designed the U.S. government to limit its own power and safeguard the rights of citizens, rights they called unalienable, meaning they can't be taken away. She points to the Declaration of Independence's promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as a core example of these protected freedoms. Gabbard argues that the Democratic Party, in her view, now disrespects these fundamental principles, including a belief in God and the Constitution. She feels they prioritize power over the well-being of the people. This shift, she states, made it impossible for her to remain a Democrat in good conscience. She doesn't shy away from strong language, accusing the party of actively undermining the very freedoms it once championed. To illustrate her point about government overreach, Gabbard recounts the story of Japanese Americans during World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government, fueled by fear and prejudice, forcibly removed over 122,000 people of Japanese descent, many of whom were American citizens, from their homes and placed them in internment camps. She highlights the injustice of this situation. These individuals were never accused of any crime, never given a trial, and lost everything. Despite this, many Japanese Americans bravely volunteered to serve in the U.S. military, even forming highly decorated units like the 442nd Infantry Regiment, demonstrating their loyalty despite the unfair treatment they received. Gabbard uses this historical example to show how easily fear can be used to justify taking away people's freedoms, a pattern she sees repeating itself today. Gabbard then focuses on the USA Patriot Act, passed after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. While acknowledging the need for security, she criticizes the act for granting the government excessive surveillance powers with limited oversight. She explains how the law allowed the government to collect vast amounts of data on ordinary Americans, including phone records and internet activity, often without a warrant. She points to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, court as a secretive body that almost always approves government requests for surveillance, effectively rubber-stamping actions that could violate citizens' privacy. She argues that this expansion of government power was a betrayal of the principles of the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Gabbard shares a story about a conversation with former Congressmen Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich, who expressed their concerns about the rushed passage of the Patriot Act and the pressure from the Bush administration to approve it without proper debate. She highlights the case of Russ Feingold, the only senator to vote against the bill, and the small number of House representatives who joined him, facing criticism for prioritizing civil liberties over perceived security. She emphasizes that once freedoms are given up to the government, they are very difficult to regain. She further illustrates this point with the story of James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, who lied under oath to Congress about the extent of government surveillance. Gabbard is outraged that Clapper faced no consequences for his dishonesty, while others, like Michael Cohen, were prosecuted for lesser offenses. This, she believes, demonstrates a double standard and the unchecked power of the national security state. Gabbard expresses disappointment with President Obama, who she initially supported because of his earlier criticisms of the Patriot Act. She feels he betrayed his promises by defending the NSA's surveillance programs and failing to enact meaningful reforms. She also criticizes the willingness of both Democrats and Republicans to prioritize security over civil liberties. Finally, Gabbard warns about the potential dangers of a central bank digital currency, CBDC, a digital form of the U.S. dollar controlled by the government. She fears that a CBDC would give the government the power to monitor and control how people spend their money, potentially restricting purchases or freezing accounts. She points to examples in Canada and Europe, where governments have taken steps to limit cash transactions and control citizens' finances. Gabbard concludes by emphasizing the importance of protecting economic freedom and resisting government overreach, arguing that these are essential for preserving a free society. She believes the Democratic Party's current trajectory threatens these fundamental principles, and that's why she could no longer remain a member. Chapter 3: No Free Speech. Tulsi Gabbard details a significant shift in her political beliefs, ultimately leading to her departure from the Democratic Party. Initially drawn to the party at age 21 because of its perceived commitment to free speech and inclusivity, Gabbard recounts a Hawaii political landscape that welcomed diverse viewpoints and encouraged open debate. Nationally, she believed Democrats championed civil liberties, even when those views were unpopular. However, she argues this has drastically changed. Gabbard's core reason for leaving centers on what she sees as the Democratic Party's increasing suppression of free speech. She believes the party now prioritizes controlling the narrative and silencing dissenting voices, a stark contrast to the principles that initially attracted her. She frames this as an obsession with power, where only approved speech is protected while opposing views are actively censored. This concern isn't abstract for Gabbard. She feels it directly impacts anyone challenging the established power structure. She emphasizes that once censorship becomes accepted, who gets silenced depends on whoever is in charge, leaving no one truly safe. The author connects this shift to her own experiences serving in the Army and taking an oath to defend the Constitution, particularly the right to free speech. She recalls the powerful sentiment, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," highlighting the importance of protecting even unpopular opinions. She contrasts this with what she perceives as a growing unwillingness among Democrats to uphold this principle. She cites Representative Stacey Plaskett's statement that free speech is not absolute as evidence of this new norm. Gabbard worries this attitude contributes to a lack of civics education, where young people are taught to avoid offensive ideas rather than engage with them critically. Gabbard illustrates her point with several examples. She references the House Select Committee hearing featuring Robert F. Kennedy Jr., where a Democratic representative attempted to rescind Kennedy's invitation to testify based on accusations of bias. She views this as a blatant attempt to silence a speaker in a hearing about censorship. She also points to instances of censorship in publishing and academia, such as the call to ban Abigail Shrier's book and the attempt to cancel a book deal with Justice Amy Coney Barrett, arguing these demonstrate a willingness to suppress views simply because they are disagreed with. She contrasts the American commitment to free speech with countries like Iran and North Korea, where dissent is met with severe punishment, and even with Western nations like Australia and the United Kingdom, where free speech isn't constitutionally guaranteed. The author further details her concerns about the collaboration between the government and big tech companies to censor online speech, referencing the Twitter files and the Missouri v. Biden lawsuit. She reveals her own name appeared on a list of individuals targeted for censorship due to her critical views of the Biden administration. Gabbard recounts her own experience with Google suspending her campaign's advertising account during her presidential run, suggesting a deliberate attempt to limit her reach. She describes how the Democratic Party, along with the media and tech companies, worked to discredit information unfavorable to their candidate during the 2020 election, using accusations of Russian disinformation to suppress damaging stories. Gabbard laments the ACLU's shift away from its traditional role as a staunch defender of free speech, criticizing its new policy of only supporting speech that aligns with its values. She sees this as a symptom of a broader trend, where institutions are prioritizing political alignment over constitutional principles. She concludes by emphasizing the importance of defending free speech as the cornerstone of a democratic society. warning that the current trajectory threatens the very foundations of American freedom. She urges readers to actively resist censorship and reclaim their right to think and speak freely, echoing the spirit of the nation's founders. Chapter 4, They See God as the Enemy. Tulsi Gabbard explains in this chapter why she decided to leave the Democratic Party, a decision she didn't take lightly. For Gabbard, it all comes down to what she sees as a growing hostility towards faith and religion within the party. She grew up in a home where both Christian and Hindu traditions were celebrated, and this upbringing instilled in her a deep sense of spirituality and a belief in a higher power. She feels this foundation gave her life purpose and strength, something she believes everyone should be free to experience. Gabbard argues that the Democratic Party has shifted away from its historical support of religious freedom. She recalls a time when the party seemed welcoming to people of all beliefs, but now she believes party leaders actively try to push God out of public life. She doesn't see this as simply a matter of differing opinions, but as an attack on a core American freedom. She points to the First Amendment of the Constitution, which protects the right to practice any religion or no religion at all, as proof of how important religious liberty is to the country's founding. The author shares a personal experience that fueled her frustration. When her father was running for Congress in 2004, his opponent, Ed Case, a Democrat, questioned his Catholic faith publicly. Gabbard felt this was a deliberate attempt to discredit her father by raising doubts about his trustworthiness based on his religion. She was especially upset because she was preparing to deploy to Iraq to defend the very freedoms that Case seemed to be undermining at home. This incident showed her how easily faith could be weaponized for political gain. Gabbard also describes a pattern of hypocrisy she observed within the Democratic Party. She notes that politicians often visit churches and talk about their faith during election season, but then seem to dismiss or even belittle people of faith behind closed doors. She uses Barack Obama's 2008 comment about working-class voters, clinging to guns or religion, as an example of this condescending attitude. She believes Democrats often view religious people as uneducated or backward, despite seeking their votes. The author recounts further instances of what she perceives as anti-faith bias. She mentions the COVID-19 pandemic, when Democrat leaders shut down churches while allowing businesses like casinos and liquor stores to remain open. She saw this as a clear sign that the government valued material things over spiritual well-being. She also points to the FBI memo that labeled traditional Catholics as potential extremists, and the Biden administration's efforts to revoke a Trump-era rule protecting religious student groups on college campuses. Gabbard contrasts this with the views of America's founders, like George Washington, who openly acknowledged God's role in the nation's success. She emphasizes that the Constitution doesn't prohibit religion, but rather protects the right to practice it freely. She believes the Democratic Party's current stance is a betrayal of these founding principles. She recalls Jimmy Carter, a devout Christian, being president in 1976, but notes that even then, some within the party saw his faith as a political liability. Ultimately, Gabbard concludes that the Democratic Party has become hostile to those who believe in God. She believes they see faith as an obstacle to their power and control. She argues that this is a dangerous path, as it undermines the very foundation of American freedom. She feels that a government that tries to be more powerful than God is a threat to liberty, and that's why she can no longer align herself with the Democratic Party. She emphasizes that recognizing a higher power is essential for protecting our rights, as it acknowledges that those rights come from something greater than government. Chapter 5, The Elitist Cabal of Warmongers. Tulsi Gabbard details a significant shift in her political beliefs, ultimately leading to her departure from the Democratic Party. She argues the party has been taken over by an elitist cabal of woke warmongers who are recklessly pushing the world toward nuclear war. Gabbard doesn't see this as a simple disagreement on policy, but a fundamental change in the party's core values and a dangerous escalation of global tensions. She believes the Democratic Party, under the influence of figures like Hillary Clinton, intentionally stoked a new Cold War with Russia as a strategy to discredit Donald Trump, even if it meant risking global security. The chapter centers around a frightening scenario: a false alarm of an incoming ballistic missile to Hawaii in January 2018. Gabbard, representing Hawaii in Congress at the time, vividly recounts the panic and helplessness she felt, knowing her family on the islands had no shelter. This event serves as a stark illustration of the real and terrifying consequences of escalating international conflicts and the lack of preparedness for a nuclear attack. She emphasizes that while politicians talk about war, ordinary citizens have nowhere to go for safety. This experience solidified her conviction that current leaders are failing to protect the American people. Gabbard accuses both Democrats and Republicans of being part of a war uniparty, meaning they largely agree on the need for constant military intervention, fueled by the military-industrial complex. She points to President Eisenhower's warning about the dangers of this complex, arguing it prioritizes profit over peace. She criticizes the willingness of politicians to engage in regime change wars, citing the examples of Iraq and Libya and the disastrous consequences that followed. She believes these actions don't make America safer, but instead create more instability and fuel extremism. The author highlights a specific instance of her frustration with the Democratic Party. A letter drafted by progressive members of Congress in 2022 urging President Biden to pursue a diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine. Gabbard explains that the letter was quickly retracted after backlash from the party establishment, demonstrating their unwillingness to challenge the prevailing hawkish stance. This incident, she says, confirmed her belief that the party was completely controlled by those who prioritize conflict over peace. She felt the party was more interested in weakening Russia than in finding a peaceful solution to the conflict in Ukraine. Gabbard recalls a personal experience during the Obama administration when she opposed military intervention in Syria. She describes being contacted by a high-ranking official from Michelle Obama's office, who angrily questioned her loyalty to the president for disagreeing with his policy. This experience, she says, illustrated the pressure within the Democratic Party to fall in line and the lack of genuine debate about critical foreign policy decisions. She felt she was being punished for prioritizing the safety of the American people over party loyalty. Ultimately, Gabbard's decision to leave the Democratic Party stems from her belief that it has become a dangerous force, actively promoting war and jeopardizing global security. She argues that the party's leaders are driven by a thirst for power and are willing to sacrifice the well-being of the American people to achieve their goals. She calls for a shift in American foreign policy, prioritizing diplomacy, respect for other nations, and a commitment to peace. She believes that true leadership requires courage to challenge the status quo and prioritize the safety and security of all people, not just those in power. Chapter 6: Fomenting Racism. Tulsi Gabbard's chapter explains her reasons for leaving the Democratic Party, a decision she says weighed heavily on her heart. Growing up in Hawaii, a place known for its mix of cultures and the spirit of aloha, a belief in connection and treating everyone with respect, she initially believed the Democratic Party shared her values of judging people based on character, not skin color. She remembers reading about heroes like Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King Jr., and admiring their fight for equality. However, her father's personal experiences with racism in the segregated South during the 1950s and 60s deeply impacted her, showing her the harsh reality of prejudice firsthand. He faced discrimination simply because of his skin color, being called names, and denied basic rights. Gabbard explains that when she first joined the Democratic Party over 20 years ago, she saw leaders who seemed dedicated to fulfilling Dr. King's dream. But she argues that the party has changed, and today's leaders, what she calls the Democrat elite, have betrayed that dream. She believes they are now actively dividing people based on race, using what she terms identity politics for their own benefit. She points to programs that teach children they are either privileged or oppressed based solely on their race, suggesting this creates division instead of unity. For example, she describes how some schools are now teaching children to feel guilty or ashamed based on their racial background, rather than focusing on individual character. The author recounts a trip to Selma, Alabama, with Congressman John Lewis, a civil rights icon, to commemorate the historic March for Voting Rights. She remembers Lewis encouraging everyone to make some good trouble, to challenge injustice and work for positive change. However, she contrasts this inspiring message with what she sees happening within the Democratic Party today. She feels the party has moved away from King's vision of equality and is now promoting what she considers to be a form of reverse racism. She specifically criticizes ideas promoted by people like Ibram X. Kendi, who suggests that the only way to fix past discrimination is to discriminate now, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who she says makes broad, negative statements about white people. Gabbard details her concerns about the growing popularity of ideas presented in books like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. She explains that DiAngelo's work argues that all white people are inherently racist and cannot escape that identity. The author finds this idea absurd and believes it's being used to create division and resentment. She describes how these ideas are being spread through diversity seminars, where people are told they are racist simply because of their skin color. She believes this is a betrayal of King's dream, which was about judging people as individuals, not as members of a racial group. Ultimately, Gabbard states she could no longer support a party she believes is actively fomenting racism and division. She emphasizes the importance of remembering King's message of unity and treating everyone with love and respect, drawing on the Hawaiian concept of aloha. She believes that recognizing our shared humanity as children of God is the key to overcoming racism and building a better future. She concludes by urging Americans to reject hatred and embrace the ideals of equality and justice that King fought for, reminding readers that we are all more than just the color of our skin. Chapter 7, What's True, the Powerful Decide. Tulsi Gabbard explains in this chapter why she could no longer stay with the Democratic Party. It all comes down to what she sees as a rejection of truth and a dangerous grab for power by the party's leaders. She believes the Democrats have moved away from believing in facts and are instead trying to control what people think is true. Gabbard starts by remembering simple truths she learned as a child. The sky is blue, fire is hot. She contrasts this with what she sees happening now, where Democrats, in her view, are denying basic biological realities, specifically the differences between men and women. She feels this isn't just about science. It's about a larger problem of dismissing objective truth, things that are simply true regardless of opinion. For example, she recalls growing up knowing the difference between boys and girls, and how that felt natural and obvious. She describes her own childhood, playing with her brothers and enjoying traditionally boyish activities, but never questioning their sex or her own. The core of her argument is that the Democratic Party is willing to ignore facts to gain political advantage. She uses the example of transgender athletes, specifically Riley Gaines, a swimmer who had to compete against Leah Thomas, a biological male competing as a female athlete. Gabbard details how Gaines and other female athletes felt unfairly disadvantaged and even unsafe, sharing a locker room with Thomas. She emphasizes that Thomas, previously ranked much lower as a male swimmer, began winning competitions after transitioning and competing as a woman. Gabbard points to scientific studies suggesting that even after hormone therapy, biological males retain physical advantages over biological females in sports. She argues this isn't about being unkind to transgender people, but about fairness and protecting opportunities for women. Gabbard doesn't shy away from strong language, describing the Democrats' actions as insanity and a form of hatred and hostility toward women. She believes they are trying to erase women by changing language, using terms like birthing person instead of woman, and redefining what it means to be female. She highlights instances like USA Today naming a man identifying as a woman as one of its Women of the Year, and the Biden administration's changes to Title IX, a law designed to protect women's access to education and sports. She explains Title IX was originally meant to create equal opportunities for women in schools and athletics, but now, she believes, it's being twisted to include transgender individuals in a way that harms female athletes. The author also recounts how she introduced the Protect Women's Sports Act, which aimed to clarify that Title IX protections are based on biological sex. She faced intense backlash, being labeled with harsh terms like transphobe and bigot. Gabbard sees this as evidence of the Democrats' unwillingness to engage in honest debate and their desire to silence anyone who disagrees with their views. She feels this demonstrates a dangerous trend of punishing those who speak out against the party's ideology. Gabbard concludes by warning that this rejection of truth extends beyond the issue of gender and sports. She believes the Democrats are creating a world where anything can be true or false depending on who is in power, and where freedom of speech is under attack. She urges readers to speak out against this insanity and to reject politicians who are willing to sacrifice truth for political gain. Ultimately, Gabbard left the Democratic Party because she felt it had become a place where facts didn't matter and where she could no longer, in good conscience, support its policies. Chapter 8, Families Under Fire. Tulsi Gabbard details in this chapter the reasons behind her departure from the Democratic Party, framing it as a breaking point reached due to the party's perceived attacks on families and children. Gabbard argues that the Democratic establishment has shifted towards prioritizing state control over parental rights, a stance she finds deeply concerning. She believes Democrats are actively undermining the traditional family structure in pursuit of power, pushing agendas that she views as harmful to children's well-being. A central concern for Gabbard is what she describes as the indoctrination of children in schools. She alleges that schools are teaching young students about complex and sensitive topics like systemic racism, gender identity, and sexual orientation without parental consent or input. She specifically criticizes the encouragement of gender-affirming care for children, including hormone treatments and surgeries, without involving parents in the decision-making process. Gabbard paints a picture of parents being silenced, ridiculed, and even threatened if they object to these practices, going so far as to claim the Biden administration has labeled some objecting parents as domestic terrorists. This, she states, was the final straw that led to her leaving the party. Gabbard contrasts her own upbringing, which included homeschooling and a strong emphasis on real-world learning through her family's business, with what she sees as the current state of education. She fondly recalls a childhood where learning was practical and values-based, a stark contrast to what she perceives as a modern education system focused on ideological indoctrination and standardized testing. She emphasizes that teachers are not to blame, but rather the teachers' unions and politicians who dictate curriculum and restrict educators' freedom. She illustrates this with her own experience campaigning, where she heard from parents in rural communities desperate for school choice options. The author highlights the widespread support for school choice, citing a poll showing a majority of Americans, across party lines, favor allowing parents to choose where their children attend school. Gabbard attributes the Democrats' opposition to school choice to the influence of teachers' unions, specifically calling out Randi Weingarten, the head of the nation's largest teachers' union, for arguing that school choice undermines democracy. Gabbard counters this argument by asserting that taxpayer dollars should follow the child, allowing parents to select the educational environment that best suits their needs. She points to statistics showing low literacy rates as evidence of the public school system's failures. Gabbard then expands on the broader issue of the Democrat elite's agenda, arguing that it prioritizes power and a specific value system over the actual education and well-being of children. She expresses alarm over the sexualization of young children, citing examples of inappropriate books and shows being introduced in schools. She recounts her experience speaking with parents at a rally in Virginia, where she learned about the successful effort to defeat a gubernatorial candidate who had expressed skepticism about parental involvement in education. She shares the story of Chloe Cole, a young woman who detransitioned after undergoing gender-affirming care as a minor, as a cautionary tale about the potential harms of these practices. The author criticizes the practice of schools withholding information from parents about their children's gender identity and facilitating access to medical interventions without parental consent. She condemns the threat of losing custody of children for parents who oppose these interventions, describing it as a violation of fundamental rights. Gabbard acknowledges the dedication of many teachers, but places the blame for the problems in the education system on teachers' unions and politicians who prioritize power over student success. She argues that the focus should be on providing a strong foundation in core subjects and respecting parental authority in raising their children. Finally, Gabbard emphasizes the importance of family as the foundation of society and criticizes the Democratic Party for policies she believes undermine families, such as incentives for single motherhood, promotion of abortion, and a complex adoption process. She concludes by urging voters to prioritize leaders who will uphold the Constitution and put the well-being of the people first, suggesting that a shift in leadership is necessary to restore a focus on family values and individual freedom. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.